Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bindu's very first webinar. We hope that you're all really enjoying the Spring Challenge. But at the same time, we have had questions from people as to how certain features work. So we thought it might be a good idea to run a webinar. And we're keen to make it quite interactive. So I've got a couple of slides. It's going to give you sort of a high-level overview of how the app works. And then we're actually going to run a sort of a live demonstration where I'll show you my version of the app, and we'll just actually run through the app and all the features and chat about them. Try not to go into too much detail. I do realize that when the app's new to someone, there are a lot of features, so we are going to step through it quite slowly. Some of you might have been using the app for a bit longer than new users, might know a lot more, but we're going to just start with the simple steps of setting up your profile and then run through the core features. So logging species, creating and managing lists. Lists in Bïndo work a little bit differently to other birding apps. We'll chat a little bit about atlasing. We think that the Southern African Bird Atlas project's a really important conservation project. We're very passionate about it and want to support it, which is why we've included atlasing features in Bïndo. So we'll run through that as well. And then I think what separates Bïndo apart from other apps is the features around exploring some of the data in the app, and then also areas and private challenges. We know the birders like to challenge their friends, so we've got some really cool features around that. So I thought maybe just to start, it would make sense just to run through some of the high-level features of the app. So I've included a screenshot here just to label and point out some of the features. So starting top left, that little icon is obviously your profile. So that's where you go in and manage all the information about yourself. Then that top row of photos, that's what we call the reel. So that's where you can see who's birding today or who's been birding in the last week. If we then look at the bottom menu of the app, there are 5 different sections. There's the feed, which we'll look at now. There's an explore tab, which allows you to explore all the data within the app. There's the obvious feature of adding a sighting. Listing, that's where you manage all of your lists. And then finally, areas. Something which is quite subtle on the interface is the search feature. So at the top in the middle, there's that little search icon in Bïndo. If you click on that, that allows you to search for other birders. That's a shortcut. And then finally, another important feature is that little green square in the top right. That's how you create a new list. So that's the overview. I think, so when you first log into the app, and some of you might still be seeing this, there's a card here saying what's in my feed. And we use these little colored icons to differentiate between different types of sightings. The normal sightings won't have these little icons, but sightings that are of significance, we will flag them. The obvious one is a lifer. So this is obviously in the context of Bïndo. So when you've logged a bird for the first time in Bïndo, it'll show this little yellow square. If a species is interesting, and you might ask, how do we define interesting? So that's a pre-populated list that we've flagged, or rather defined as birds that we feel Southern African birders would find interesting. So they get the green circle. And then finally, unusual gets the red triangle. And the unusual categorization is based on Southern African Bird Atlas data. Maybe that's an important point I should highlight, is that we've relied quite heavily on the Atlas data that's been collected over the last 20 years. That's, if you think about that data, it's used in all of our field guides. And it's really important that obviously birders continue to contribute to that data. But what it's allowed us to do is we can use that as a sort of an underlying base. And then if someone logs a bird in an area where the Atlas data tells us that it shouldn't be there, we can then flag it as unusual. So that's a good way to figure out if you're seeing the right birds in the right place. Cool. I'm going to stop sharing this slide and we're going to switch over to a live demo. Okay, so what I've done is I've plugged my phone into my laptop. So you're actually viewing my version of the app. So the idea now is that I'm going to run through all the different features. And I would encourage you to perhaps have that open in front of you as well. So you can also take a look through and navigate as we go. I think I'll start with profile, which is top left. So I think when you first log into the app, it's important to set it up correctly. So I've clicked on the profile on the top left, and now I'm going to click edit profile. And this is the first sort of screen you'll see when you set up the app. The obvious fields are name and surname. You'll notice that we ask that people use their real names. We're very focused on building a community of birders in Southern Africa, and we feel it's important that everyone uses correct information and just so we can all get to know each other. So that's important. And then just to run down the list here. So people sometimes ask, how do I keep my data private? So one is able to run the app in private mode. So it's called private profile. You can slide that, and that will then remove your details from the app. So effectively, you'll be using the app on your own. You can see other people's data, but no one else will see your data. Then you can also turn on auto lifers. Birders, they often keep their life list in many different places. You might not want to have the auto lifer tag set on here, because what it will do is every time you see a lifer, it'll flag it in the feed for people who follow you. So yeah, it's worth giving that some consideration. The next field is quite important if you want to atlas in the app. So you'll see there that I've included my Atlas Observer ID, 11585. And if I had to take that number out, the atlasing features will actually disappear from the app. So it's important that if you want to atlas using Bïndo, to enable the features, you have to go and get your Observer ID either from BirdLasser or from the Subbab website and enter them into this field. Then just quickly to run through the next 2 points, so BirdLasser exports and eBird exports. So I guess to my previous point, people use multiple apps and store their data in different places. We feel quite strongly that people's birding data is theirs and they must own it and manage it and control it. So we enable you to, if you log data in Bïndo, you can export it to BirdLasser or to eBird, because lots of birders use those platforms. When you end the list in Bïndo, you will automatically be emailed a copy, a CSV file, both for BirdLasser and eBird upload, just to make that really easy. So that's the profile page. And then it's also quite cool if you add a photo. It doesn't have to be a photo of you. It can be a photo of a landscape or a bird, but it's quite nice to personalize your profile a bit. So now I've clicked back to the profile page, and this provides a nice summary of all of your data. So it's got the life list, it's got a list of all of your sightings, it's also got a list of all of your lists, and also a nice summary of interesting records and also unverified sightings. Maybe this is a good time to touch on unverified. So I mentioned earlier the fact that we use Atlas data to effectively work out if people are seeing birds in the right places. So sometimes so I'm sitting in Cape Town, if I had to log a Pel's fishing owl in Newlands, which is, you would laugh at that, but it's, as you all know, that's not impossible. It has happened before. But if I had to log a Pel's fishing owl, it would be flagged as unverified. So it actually won't appear in the feed. It will appear in your list, but it'll be grayed out. So there is a vetting process just to make sure that those sightings are verified before that sort of data is committed to any sort of public feed or to other platforms. It's not unlike the process that happens with the Bird Atlas project when you get an out of range form. And then, then there's just a summary of the bar chart, all of your birding over the months. You can see I had a busy June. July, I was a bit slack, and now that's spring, I need to get going. Cool. And then obviously you can also look at all of your photos. Right. So that's the profile. So this is the feed. Now the feed is where you will view sighting and list data from people you follow. So you have to, as I'm sure you've all gathered, this is a social listing app. So if you think about other apps out there like eBird and BirdLasser, they are primarily listing apps. So you can't see what other birders are doing. Whereas I mentioned earlier, we're keen to build a birding community. The social aspects of Bïndo are quite important. So starting at the top, that's what we call the reel. So you can basically just scroll through this and see who's been birding today. What is amazing, what really stands out for me is how much birding happens during the week. I obviously have the wrong job because I definitely don't do as much birding as most other birders are doing in Bïndo. But it's very cool to see. If I just click on Rob, for example, you can actually click on his photo and it will show me a list of the birds he saw today. And then you can also click on a map and it'll actually take you to the area where Rob went birding. So he was in Kirstenbosch today. So it's a nice way to virtually meet other birders and follow other birders. You can click through and follow anyone, maybe someone who's birding in your area, or maybe you're going to a new area and you want to maybe reach out to other birders. Already we've seen quite nice examples of, I know someone was going to East London and there's a very active birder there, Robin Scott. And I know they connected through Bïndo and they went birding together, which is a really cool result. So that's the reel, and that's really the primary way to see who's birding and who to potentially follow within Bïndo. I'm sure you're all aware of the Spring Challenge. There's a leaderboard here. I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not really featuring anywhere near the top yet, but it's great to see all of the activity that's happening. Then so these are all the people I follow in the app. And so you can see Seth saw a lifer today, brown-beaked honeybird, which is really cool. And then what's nice about Bïndo, as you'll see, is that you can also add photos to your sightings and to your lists. You can see Seth here has added some really cool photos as he went birding today. So these are sightings. So when you add a photo to a sighting, it will appear in the feed. And then other items that appear in the feed are lists. Johan Roos, he went birding today and he created this list. And importantly, he ended the list. And that then pushes the ended list to the feed. So if you click on that list, it takes me through to the list itself. a subtle feature, if you then want to go from the list to the map view, on the top is a small little map icon. If you click on that, it'll take you to the area where you went birding today, so you can see the pins and the actual species. I'm just going to click back to the list and then there. Yeah, so the feed is, yeah, you can see someone when they start a list or when they end a list. Jeff's been doing a lot of birding on the West Coast, which is great to see. You can click into his photos and see photos, which is really cool. And I guess if you also think about it, it's a way to, capture your own birding memories. And what I really like is that if you go to the listing screen and you go to all of your lists, these are all of my lists. And then if you click top, you can then look at your lists in feed format. So this is your own sort of private feed. And why I really like this is that these are effectively memories of all of my birding experiences. So I think that's I think a really important driver behind Bïndo as well. It's a great way to capture your memories. Okay, so that's the feed. I think that's self-explanatory. I'm going to jump from the feed to add sighting because I think that's really a core part of Bïndo. So once you've set up your profile, Bïndo at its core is a listing app, perhaps a social listing app. And the reason why we would use the app is to record our birds. And I think what's a really sort of nifty feature is the fact that when you want to add a sighting, we have these two tabs, nearby and Southern Africa. So Southern Africa is a list of all Southern African species, and nearby is a list of the closest 200 species, but ranked in abundance order. So like I said, I'm sitting in Claremont, Cape Town, and these are all the common birds that I'll see in my area, in fact, in my garden. And that's great because I think it's particularly helpful for new birders. Effectively, you've got, instead of having to wade through an entire bird book, you've got a nice short list of common birds around you. And as you move, so I was in Joburg last week, and it was great to see when I got to Joburg, the list immediately changed and I saw the common birds that I could expect in that area. So that's really useful. And then when you want to add a species, you can just hit the plus sign. So I'm just going to add an Egyptian goose. So I just hit the plus. An Egyptian goose is now added as a sighting. You can also add a hardy-daw and a Cape robin chat. So, and you'll see that also below the species, it'll turn green, meaning that I've logged it. What you can also do is you can actually long press. So you can hold down the plus. I'm holding down Egyptian goose. And this allows you to do an advanced sighting. So this allows you to either add a photo or to actually move the pin. I'm just going to close it again. So add a few more species as we go. Southern double-collared sunbird and pike crow. Right. So that's my list. So that's now if I'm just adding them off the actual screen. But sometimes there'll be birds that aren't on the screen, or you have to scroll down quite far. So you can also click in the search box, and there's also some nifty shortcuts to find species. So the general rules are, so if it's a two-worded bird name, say for example, I can't think now, olive thrush, you can use the first two letters of the first word, and then T, and then it will immediately show olive thrush. Let's say it's reed cormorant. I can go R-E and then C, and then it shows reed cormorant. So the first two letters and then the first letter of the second. So and you'll notice as well that when you add it, it immediately clears, so you can then fill in text. So it makes logging very quick. Then if it's a three-lettered word, so for example, Cape robin chat, I could just go CRC and Cape robin chat will come up. Or we'll find Cape robin chat, Southern double-collared sunbird is SDC, and that comes up really quickly. So those are really, I guess, useful shortcuts to get to birds quite quickly. We feel it's quite important that birders are able to log birds very quickly, because we don't necessarily want to be, peering into our phones all the time. You want to be birding. You want to have your head up. You want to be looking around, listening. And so the idea is that the phone stays in the pocket. I guess when you first arrive at a new spot, you might spend the first 10 minutes logging all the common birds, and that should be quite quick. But then after that, I prefer to put the phone away. And then if I do need to add a bird, I can put it out and it takes me a couple of seconds, and then I can put it away again. So I'm focused on the actual birding. On the top left-hand side is a little orange box with a 7 in it. So again, in the spirit of being really fast and snappy, so the birds that you've logged now are now sitting on your phone. They haven't been synced to the database yet, to the server yet. So they sit on your phone, and that makes everything very fast. And if I click on the top on that 7, these are now all the unsynced sightings that you would then need to commit to the database. What's nice about this page is that you can actually edit. There's no way I saw a reformer to my garden, so I can click on those three little dots on the right, and I can actually delete that sighting before I've sent it to the server. So it's quite nice to be able to edit your list and maybe just run through it just to check that there haven't been any finger slips. And then I hit sync, and then all of these sightings then get committed to my profile on the actual Bïndo database. So syncing's usually pretty quick, and that's how you log birds. What's also a quite nice feature is that if you click on the actual bird name, so I'm now going to click on Cape White-eye, it will give you a profile of that species. So it includes some photos, which is quite nice for beginners. It gives you some sighting data, so all of my sightings for that species. And then also importantly, if you look on the top right, is a small little map icon. You click on that, and that will actually give you a distribution map for that species within Bïndo. So these are all of the records of Cape White-eye that have been logged in Bïndo. And okay, maybe Cape White-eye wasn't a great example. Let's try and find a more interesting species. Pop back here. Let's go with, put my phone on do not disturb. So let's do that. Let's go with something woodall. African woodall. So there's been quite a bit of interest around the woodalls that have been seen in Cape Town. So if we click on the map in the top, these are all the woodalls that have been logged in the region. If you think about eBird, generally put sighting data into a hotspot, and BirdLasser lumps data into pentads. But what's quite nice about Bïndo is that we use GPS data. So you can see exactly where woodalls have been seen in this area, which is quite interesting. There's been a bird that's been fairly confiding close to UCT. I see it hasn't been logged yet. But yeah, it's a nice way to dig around, particularly if they're birds. Maybe you're going to a new area and you want to try and find a particular species. You can then actually log into the species page and look at the distribution map to find out where it's been seen. You can see your sightings. You can look at the most recent sightings, and then you can also look at how many times it's appeared in your list. And then it also includes some community photos. So people who have added woodall photos to their sightings, they'll also appear here, which is nice. In fact, I think this is the Rondebosch bird, which is cool. Let me clear that. Okay, so we know how to log sightings. Now I'm going to get onto lists. And lists are, yeah, so lists work a bit differently in Bïndo to other apps. I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. And please let me know if I'm making no sense. So we've added a bunch of sightings. And if you think about other birding apps, if you want to create a list, you will start a list. So let's say you're going to this weekend, I'm going to Betty's Bay. So I'll start a list saying Betty's Bay weekend, and I will then log birds on that list. But while I'm at Betty's Bay, let's say I want to go to Roysand Nature Reserve, I will then have to start a second list for Roysand, and I'll then add birds to that list, etc. So wherever I go, I'll have to start new lists, but there's always a one-to-one relationship between the birds that are logged and the list that's created. If you wanted a total weekend list, you would have to add the bird to your weekend list as well as to each of the other lists that you create as you go. And that's also particularly relevant for when you're atlasing, because often when you'll want to create a trip list for, say, the period that you're away, but you'll also create other lists while you're there, particularly atlas lists. And you would then need to add species to each individual list just to keep them all up to date. And that's where I think Bïndo really shines, because effectively what you can do in Bïndo is that lists are effectively like filters, and you use time and date to create those filters. So I'm going to show you an example now. So go back to the home screen. The way to start a list is in the top right-hand side. There's that little plus sign. I'm going to click on that. And these are all the list options. So the simplest one is a quick list. It works the same way as a quick list, but I guess it's a more defined use case. So if you go on a holiday, it allows you to name it correctly and also set time limits. And then the same with the custom list. It also just asks you to set a start and an end date and customize it for a period. I'll get to the group topics later on at the bottom. So I'm just going to start a quick list. Let's call this Bïndo. So I've started the list and it's got no sightings on it, right? So if I go to my listing page, which is where you find all of your lists, you just go back So here's my list, Bïndo webinar. It's got 0 sightings on it. That's because I've started it, say, 30 seconds ago, and I haven't logged any birds. But as you'll recall, I logged some birds, say, within the last 10 minutes. So if I want to add those birds to the list, I can click on the 3 dots. I can go edit, and I can click on start date. And if I just take the time back, let's go back to, say, 35 past or 36 past, and I go set, and I save that. You'll see that the list is immediately updated to 6. So it's included those birds we saw earlier. And then I can just carry on logging. I hope this sort of explains how lists work. The fact that sightings and lists are actually independent of each other. There isn't that one-to-one relationship. That example I used of going to Betty's Bay. So tomorrow I'll start a Betty's Bay birding weekend list, and I'll just let that run for the entire long weekend until Tuesday night. But while I'm there, I'll be atlasing. I'm very keen to go to Roysand. I'll probably go to Harold Porter. And when I'm there, I will create lists for each of those sites. And I'll just continue logging. I won't worry about which sightings are going to which list, because I will just start and end lists as I go. And the sightings will be allocated accordingly based on the date and time limits that I set. Just back to the example. So particularly the Betty's Bay birding weekend list, if I keep that running, all of the sightings from where I go atlasing, from Harold Porter, from Roysand, all of those sightings will be added to the weekend list because that list remains open. I haven't closed it yet, or rather I haven't ended it. And then when I finish birding at Harold Porter and when I finish birding at Roysand, I will end those lists, which will then close them off. And so no more species will be allocated to those lists. So I think that's an important point as well. If a list remains open, birds will be allocated to it. So you have to end lists so you don't add species to the wrong list. But again, because it's a filter, you can go back and edit a list by changing the date. So I guess saying it another way, what you could do is I could go birding for this entire weekend and not create any lists and just log species. But then when I get back on Tuesday night, retrospectively, I could go and create those lists by, if I know what time I was where, I could then just go and define those lists based on those dates and times and name them, and then all of those lists will be created. I hope that makes sense. I know it's not maybe intuitive, particularly because I guess we've been raised on using apps where there is that one-to-one relationship between sightings and lists. But yeah, I think this is a bit different, and I think quite powerful. If once worked out how to use it, yeah, it is quite valuable. Maybe let me just pause for a second. Are there any questions about logging species and lists?
Jenny was asking a question here in the chat about adding a sighting post birding, and she was commenting that there's a list from a few days ago that doesn't have a plus, but I think what you just covered, what I was about to respond to, is that basically the individual sighting would just need to be edited in terms of date and time.
Exactly. So let me actually give an example of that. So Jenny, let's actually look at one of my old lists here. Let's go back to this quick Kirstenbosch loop list and look at the dates. So that was on the 15th September and it was at 16:54. So if I log a sighting now, at 15 September, and 16:54. So I'm going to now add a sighting. Let's go Cape Siskin. Let's use the short code. Yes, there it is, Cape Siskin. So now I'm now going to long press on the plus, and I saw it in Kirstenbosch. So let me move around on the map. That's Newlands Forest. So this is how you edit sightings. I'm going to go here into the Protea section. I'm just going to click with my finger next to Protea, and it's going to move the sighting there. So I've put it in Kirstenbosch, but now I also need to edit the date and time. We said the 15th of September. So there, and we said the time was 1600 hours and 50. Scroll there and go set and then save. I'll just quickly sync that sighting. It should be pretty quick. Now, if we go back to that list, it just needs to update. So all of the lists are updating. You'll see it says updating there. Let's give the Kirstenbosch list to update. You'll see that my spring birding list has updated. If I click on that, the Cape Siskin is slotted in there. So it's been added to this list because I go back here, my spring birding list is still open. And if you go to that Kirstenbosch list, there it is, Cape Siskin. So it's been added to that list. I've just slotted it in the order that I sought using the date and the time. So even though I've logged it now, I can add it to that list. Then at the same time, I can go back here and I can just click on the 3 dots next to Cape Siskin and I can delete that sighting. And that will then remove it. And then see that it also went off, it's disappeared off my spring building list. So all the lists I have open at the time will then be affected by that sighting. So that's an important thing. It's just always be aware of which lists you have open, and as soon as you've finished birding in an area, it's just to end them. They aren't added incorrectly, but you can easily edit them after the fact. Okay, so that's adding sightings and that's listing.
Dave, there's another question in the feed. It's around adding birds to an existing list that you've closed already, but you want to reopen it again when you go back to an area.
Okay. So you can't reopen a list. So yeah, you can't. Okay, now I'm giving away trade secrets. There is a hack, right? To pause a list. So if you use an Atlas card, you can pause Atlas cards, which will then effectively nothing will be added to that Atlas card until you unpause it. So if you went to Kirstenbosch, you could run an Atlas card and pause it that way. But there's actually an even better feature to understand which birds you've seen in Kirstenbosch over time. And maybe that's a good time to get into areas. So in the bottom right-hand side, there's an area tab. And what these are, so we've geofenced different geographical areas in Southern Africa, ranging from the entire region. So at the moment, you'll see it shows which areas you're currently in. So Southern Africa, South Africa, City of Cape Town, and then also nearby areas. So then it ranks areas based on proximity. If we click on Kirstenbosch, this is a defined area. So we put a geofence boundary around the area. So if anyone goes to Kirstenbosch and logs birds in Bïndo, it will automatically add all of that data to the Kirstenbosch area. This is obviously not my view, but you will then be put onto a leaderboard. If I click on the all-time leaderboard, you'll see that this is a completely random example. I didn't choose it because I happen to be at the top. In fact, I was actually tying with Mike up until the weekend, and I managed to sneak ahead with a very cheeky sacred ibis, which he already has on his list. But yeah, so everyone who's gone or who's been birding at Kirstenbosch gets added to the leaderboard. So this is a real sort of fun way to gamify birding slightly. It shows you who was birding in Kirstenbosch today. So Rob was obviously there. Also who's been there in the last week. Recent highlights is really nice. So striped flufftail is, in fact, at the moment, they're quite active and vocal. You got to go up Skeleton Gorge to get to them. And then there was the very popular Neisner warbler from last year. It was actually just outside Kirstenbosch, but just within the geofence boundary. Yeah, so you don't necessarily need to keep the running list for a location if it is an area. We've also curated a list for different sites. These are all species that have been logged in Kirstenbosch. And there's your radar. So this is a really nice sort of handy tool, which I haven't mentioned before. So this is, if you click on your radar, these are species that have been logged or occur in an area which you haven't logged in Bïndo yet. So this is effectively a target list, which is really nice. That's really handy. And then I guess it breaks down all of the stats based on different years, different months, and weeks. That's a nice way to slice and dice the data. So we've got over 200 areas at the moment, and we add into them all of the time. All of the time. All we need is a geofenced KML file, which can be easily created with a polygon in Google Earth. So they're pretty easy to create. So we can. In fact, I was chatting to Adam Cruikshank earlier today, and he was saying there are some really popular spots in Durban that he's keen to get added. So that is possible. We can add more areas to the app. But what's also quite nice is if you go into a new region, you can look through areas and see where you can go birding. So I mentioned the radar, but if I just go back to lists, the feature I didn't mention, which I think is also really valuable, is so we've created this Bïndo webinar list as an example. If I click into it, if I just click on the name, it takes me there. So it'll show me all of the birds that I've logged, and as in the species, the unique species. It'll show the sightings. So obviously, because sightings are different to our unique species, so if I add numerous Ardidars and a few Egyptian geese and sync those, you'll see that those are then added to the sighting list. You see the sighting number is much higher than what the actual unique species number is. But the feature I wanted to point out is nearby targets. So what's really cool about that is that this is a list of birds you haven't yet seen in the area that you're currently birding. And that's really useful because particularly when atlasing, you'll often find that you'll miss off common species. So often I'll be atlasing and I'll click over to nearby targets and I'll see that I've missed 4 or 5 like really common birds. So you can just quickly mop those up. So that's a really handy feature just to highlight on the listing screen. Now, so we've run through the feed, we chatted about adding sightings and listing in areas. So I guess one of the last features to chat to you about is Explore. So Explore is a way to view all of Bindu's data. So when I say data, I'm referring to sighting, list, and photo data on a map. So wherever you zoom on a map, that data will be shown. But it can be quite overwhelming, and you'll see that we've had to use these, I guess, this sort of green shading because there's just so much data. It's quite important to filter the data before you look at it. You'll see there that it says sensitive pins may be hidden. And that's, I think, a good prompt for me to maybe just quickly chat about that. We do. So when you're logging a species that you don't necessarily want other birders to see, because we are aware that we do have a lot of endangered birds in the country, or maybe you have a bird that you don't necessarily want lots of birders seeing because this is quite accurate GPS data. So let's say I was going to log a striped flufftail. If I long press on the plus next to striped flufftail, I'll get to this sort of advanced view, and I can at the bottom there's that sensitive slider, so I can just slide that over and save that. And that then, when someone tries to zoom into the map, it won't zoom in beyond a certain point. So that's why on the explore page, you just had that little reminder that you might not be able to see seabirds that accurately. It'll show it for me because I logged the bird, but for everyone else, it'll show as sensitive. So back to explore. So because there's so much data, it's important to filter it. So if you look on the top right, to the right of the word sighting, there's this little filter icon. You click on that, and that's a way to filter the data. So sightings, lists, and photos. So if you click on list, and it's by default, it goes to 30 days. But if you move that down to this week and go apply, it'll then show all of the lists that have been created. And it'll show the data for whatever you're showing on the map. So I've zoomed out now, but if I zoom in much more closely, it'll then obviously filter it accordingly. So these are all the lists that have been created this week in the app. If I go back to sightings and get this week, let me just clear the filter to sightings and this week. And if you want to see interesting sightings or unusual or even unverified, let's go to interesting and I go apply and then zoom out. It'll flag all of the birds that are considered interesting. This is quite a nice way to, even if you're planning where to go birding on the weekend, I guess makes a nice target list. If there's some birds on here that are considered interesting, you can see that some nice birds are logged in the weekend on a pelagic, so they're all showing up in the app. So yeah, it's nice for just keeping tabs of what's been logged in the app, but also, I guess, back to the point of if you're going to a new area, it's a nice way to prepare for a trip. I'm quite keen to get up to the West Coast and see the spring flowers. So what I would do is I would just go all and go apply. And I would then just zoom in and look at what's been logged around the West Coast. And that's obviously all sighting data. But if I want to do look at some list data, I could just change that and I could look at the lists that have been logged. So yeah, it's a nice way just to catch up and see and just prepare for a trip to a new area. Yeah, are there any more questions at this point? All right. Okay, so I won't go on too much longer, but maybe one last thing I will mention is challenges and collaborative lists. So if you click on the top right on the plus sign, I mentioned some of these lists earlier, so the top lists are fairly self-explanatory. But what's quite a nice feature is if you want to run a private challenge between friends in Bïndo, you can do that. So you can set up a private challenge. I'm just going to call this a webinar challenge. And when will it start? Let's start it right away. And do I know when it will end? I will run it until, let's go just for a few days and set that. So I've set up the challenge. At the moment, it's just me, but that's a bit boring. So it's nice to add some friends. In the top right-hand side, there's a little people icon with a plus. You can click on that and I can go add new. Cool, let me add Rob. So I've invited him, add Nick as well, just because they're here this evening, so they won't be too alarmed. You can then see who you've invited, and then these are the members. Nick's joined, and hopefully Rob will join as well. Rob's also joined. Great. So now we have a private challenge. And based on the time limits that I've defined, we then go birding and effectively challenge each other. So this is a private leaderboard. So that's quite fun. If there's a long weekend coming up, and we often set these like short little challenges between ourselves. We even do a sort of a weekday challenge, like a Monday to Friday. You can try and sneak out during the week and see as many birds as possible. Yeah, so it's a nice way to, I guess, have a little bit of competition between friends. And then Rob and Nick, feel free to add to that if you feel I've missed any other detail. And then the collaborative list is to list together. So what this will do is it'll create a list in both of you and a friend's version of the app. And if either of you add birds to the list, it'll then update both of your lists. So it's a nice way, again, if you're birding together, just to run one list. So again, I'll call this webinar list. I'll start it. And it works in a similar way to setting up a challenge. So I just need to add, at the moment it's just me, I can just add new. And again, I can add people and set it up like that. Won't go through the whole process now. And then finally, you've probably all noticed, but there's this little bell in the top left next to your profile image, profile icon, and you can view comments on your posts, or comments and likes and things like that. I think that probably concludes the webinar for this evening. Are there any final questions before we sign off?
Dave, I see there's one question. I don't know if you can read it in the bottom of the chat.
Okay. Can you specify whether a sighting was based on call versus sighting when logging? Yeah, you can't at the moment. So at the moment, you can say whether it's a lifer or not, but you can't specify whether it was heard or seen. No, not at this point. We are constantly evolving and developing the app. In a previous version, there was a field to add notes. That was something you could have added. But yeah, we will add that to our roadmap, and yeah, we can certainly look to add that in future. Any other questions? So we have been recording this webinar, and we will post it on YouTube and in other channels. And we will certainly run more webinars in future. And we always welcome feedback. If you have questions, you're welcome to email us at any time, or I think a lot of you have my contact details as well. So yeah, you're welcome to WhatsApp me with questions. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending, and yeah, have a great evening. Cheers.